it is so nice to have a bit of time. Time is just one of those things that when you don't have it, you really, really miss it. And when you have too much of it, you think, I wish I had something to do. So it's always, the grass seems to always be greener on the other side with these matters. Either you have too much time or you have not enough time. So both states of being are interesting, and time is one of those things. I always feel reminded of time when it comes to changing the clocks. And here in the Eastern time zone that I live in, we've just had that happen on Sunday. So on the night from Saturday into Sunday, on the, I believe, 3rd of November, don't know, that's when our clocks change. And now it's the way it works is now that the clocks go back, or they have gone back, which is always an interesting form of discussion between me and my wife. So Julia has this rule that in the fall or in the autumn, so fall means clocks go back, and in the spring they spring forward. So that's a good way to remember when the clocks go back and forth in general. But what isn't so easy is to remember on which date that happens. I remember in Europe it was at one point standardized, and it just made so much more sense after they've standardized it across Europe. So there was a time when the UK changed to a different time than the rest of Europe, which of course made things a little bit difficult. We were working in television back then at Todd.io UK in London, and when they did the MTV transmissions across Europe, there was a GMT clock, a UK clock, and the rest of Europe kind of clock. And they also had a New York clock because they were kind of linked with New York back then as well. And that was really, really difficult because for 1 or 2 weeks, Europe was out with the rest of the UK, or let's just say the UK was out of time with the rest of Europe, or on the same time zone, depending on what time of the year you look at it. And it made it really, really difficult and really messy. But that's what GMT clocks are so cool, because they don't change time. They just stay on one time, and no matter who in the whole world you talk to, we can all talk GMT time, like military time or Zulu time, and it's all the same. It just means that we can all look at one clock that never changes, and we can all agree on a particular time and a particular date. So that's really helpful. And I really like GMT. I like the fact that doesn't change. It always messes with my brain when times change. And this thing, I must admit, I've never really understood why this actually happens. Why do we feel the need to mess with the time? Just because somebody at a desk makes a decision, oh, I think that's a great idea, and then we go, great, let's do it. Why? I mean, it makes no sense. So yesterday morning was a perfect example. When I wake up, I have to take my medication every day at the same time, and that is usually 7 o'clock in the morning before breakfast at Eastern Standard Time. But then I usually take it, I go to the bathroom, I take it, I go back to bed for an hour, and then half an hour later I get up. But with the time change now, my body clock really works in a way that I kind of get up, or I'm being woken up with the sunlight. So it's really nice that my body reacts that way. And of course these days, well, when I say these days, it's only been 2 days since we've changed the clocks. I seem to have noticed that I wake up at an hour earlier. So I wake up at about 6 o'clock, and my body is saying, let's get up, and I'm thinking, yeah, it's light outside already, so why don't I do that? And usually I do, and I just stay up, and I'll see if that normalizes. But I guess my point is that it doesn't really matter what the time on the display says. I have an internal body clock that just adjusts to whatever happens outside. And I guess that's the same body clock that also makes me sleepy. And I'm thinking I would be a big fan if we could just abolish the summer wintertime thing altogether. I always thought it's a bit of a scam that, first of all, summertime is not 6 months of the year, it's 7 months of the year. So we're basically living with that much longer than with wintertime, which is kind of the regular time, I guess. And it's a weird thing to think about it, that I don't know, we basically steal an hour away from society at the beginning of the year, sometime in March, and we give it back 7 months later, and then everyone's saying, oh great, we get an hour back. Well, no, you had it already, it's just somebody thought you're not allowed to use it for 7 months, and then they give it back with no interest. So it's basically nothing really that there's that for me, for my life, and I guess for 99% of the people on this planet, there is no longer a benefit. Maybe, I don't know, 1579 there once was, or whenever summertime was introduced, I have no idea. And maybe in a previous life there may have been a really good reason to do it. It's catchphrases always, it's about the farmers, the farmers. Really, I mean, the farmers get up when they need to get up, really, whatever the LCD display on that digital clock says, one of those things. It's just, I'm not a big fan of summertime, never have been, never will be, and it's one of those things. I'm feeling reminded of this fact now because it's similar to what I had when I was in London, when I first started in London in 1999, when we had these several clocks on the wall. So right now the rest of Europe, or Europe, has already changed to summertime about 2 weeks ago, but in the US, or at least in the Eastern Standard Time Zone that we live in, we haven't quite done that yet until this week. And I don't know if it must have been last week, the week before, I don't quite remember. I don't follow the time changes in Europe anymore, but I guess my point is that for me it was easy to remember when that happened. In Europe it was always the last weekend in March and in October that the times changed, whereas here it seems to be somewhat more arbitrary. I mean, is that a rule? Is it the first week of November, the first weekend of November, where the times change? And another kind of question, mystery that I have is, does it happen? I mean, in Europe it's kind of fairly consistent that, and I remember this was a great point of discussion between me and my wife when we first got together, because I said, well, in Germany they changed the clocks at 3 in the morning to go back to 2. So you've got this thing happening in the winter at 3 in the morning, it goes back to 2, so you've got that hour double. And then in the summer it's obviously the other way around. And she insisted, no, it's not actually at 3, it's at 2. At 2 in the morning the clocks go back to 1. And I said, I'm pretty sure that this is not how we did it in Germany. And she said, well, you're just wrong. So a back and forth discussion. Keep in mind, this was years and years ago. We discovered that actually the time change happens at the same time, GMT. And that was kind of cool to see that this is actually a GMT time. So considering GMT, we all changed to summertime and wintertime at the same moment. So that makes perfect sense. But here in the US, I've never really looked into that, so I don't really know if so it does happen at 2 o'clock in the morning, Eastern Standard Time for us, but does that also mean it happens at 2 o'clock in the morning, Central, Mountain and Pacific Time? I don't know, I really must look into that. It's a very interesting question. I've never thought about it, but I know that in Europe we all change to, all countries that participate in the summertime nowadays change at the same time, GMT, to the new time. So that makes perfect sense for everybody. So there's no hour out or something, but I don't know what it's like here. Funny thing to think about times and what we do with time zones. I've read a proposal in the US. We have 5 time zones, which is a lot of time zones, and it's because the country is so wide. So we have the Eastern Standard Time here on the right hand side, I guess, and then the further we go over to the left, we have things that then include the Alaska. That's another time zone, and of course that's Hawaii. Maybe it's even 6 time zones, I don't even know, because these guys are so far away. And I read a proposal a few years ago where somebody suggested, why don't we first of all get rid of summertime? I was thinking, yes, keep reading, because that was really interesting to me. But then another thing was that he proposed an idea that we get rid of all the time zones all together. So rather than having 4 time zones or 4 main time zones in the US and kind of neglecting Alaska and Hawaii there for a moment, he said that these time zones do business with one another and with Europe. And even though the country is really wide, I mean, in Florida alone we have 2 time zones, and that's because some part of the panhandle at the top of Florida is kind of further into the left there, goes further into the country, and that's why these guys have, I believe, Central Time. It's very interesting to think about it, but if you wouldn't know any different, you could just say, well, in Tallahassee it is just darker in the morning than in, I don't know, Jacksonville, for example, rather than having to artificially make that happen. You know what I mean? And he was proposing, why not just have 2 time zones, one for the east and one for the west in the US, and then they would maybe be 2 hours out, and that is enough to compensate for the time that it would take, you know, for the kind of darkness in the morning type thing, so that doesn't, for the guys in the west, doesn't get kind of light at 11 o'clock in the morning. So that would be kind of unfair if we just put everyone on Eastern Standard Time, I guess. And he was saying, well, maybe just 2 time zones then. And then he was going further and said, well, that would, first of all, that would make business between the US, or at least the eastern seaboard, and Europe a lot easier, because it would, you know, there would only be 1 time zone for many other countries, and because the eastern seaboard is so densely populated, it makes a lot of sense to put everyone in the same kind of time zone on the east. And I thought that's a really cool idea. But then I guess he was going one step further and said, why don't we just have 2 time zones in the world, and just go and neglect Hawaii altogether, and just say, well, whatever happens in this massive gap there on the planet in the Pacific Ocean, just put the kind of date zone there somewhere, and then just have everyone on the same time zone in Europe, and then have another time zone for the Americas. Case closed. And I thought, radical, a bit too radical for my liking, a little bit too unfair, I think, for people who just don't, as I said, don't want to get up at 11 o'clock and then see the first glimpse of the sunrise. That may just be, you know, be a little bit radical. But at the end of the day, I think it's an interesting idea. You know, discuss. There we go. So in Europe, I remember the times change in the last weekend of October and the last weekend in March, and that makes perfect sense to me. And the questions I do have for me and every one of you in the audience is, when exactly do the times change in the US, and why is it this particular date that we change, like the first weekend in November and I guess the first weekend in April? I mean, it's good because for me it's kind of interesting, because this 1 week or the 2 weeks of this overlap is always a bit of an interesting one when I speak to my friends in Europe, or anyone who's either in Germany or the UK. That's kind of an interesting 2 sides of the Atlantic type puzzle, and sometimes we're just closer together. I think that's what I find interesting and fascinating about it. Still don't like this idea of summertime though, seriously.